Chief Engineer Jake Harrison had always believed that the most dangerous thing about working in alien palaces wasn't the exotic technology or the cultural misunderstandings. It was the way beautiful architecture could make you forget that you were essentially sitting in a very expensive target. The crystal spires of Queen Zarathal's palace rose like frozen lightning into the lavender sky of Ethereal Prime, their surfaces catching and refracting the system's twin suns into cascades of rainbow light that made the entire structure seem like something from a fairy tale rather than a military installation. "Gorgeous place to get yourself killed," Jake muttered, reviewing the latest intelligence briefings on his portable display while standing in what the locals called the Hall of Eternal Radiance. Really, spectacularly gorgeous, but still a place where people with big guns are planning to shoot holes in the pretty walls. 8 months of working in the ethereal dominion had given Jake a healthy appreciation for both the beauty of their crystal-growing architecture and the complete inadequacy of their defensive systems. The palace had been built during an era when the Dominion's greatest military challenge was ceremonial honor duels between neighboring houses, not systematic conquest by technologically superior enemies who considered honorable combat a quaint anachronism. The defensive upgrades he'd been installing were state-of-the-art by human standards, but Jake had a sinking feeling they were going to prove woefully inadequate when the Kethvar coalition finally decided to stop probing the system's defenses and commit to full-scale invasion. The coalition had been working their way through this sector of space with the methodical efficiency of exterminators, conquering established civilizations through superior technology, brutal tactics, and a complete disregard for anything resembling mercy. "How's the shield integration coming along, Chief?" asked Lieutenant Sarah Kim, his assistant engineer, as she emerged from a maintenance shaft with crystal dust in her hair and the satisfied expression of someone who had just convinced alien technology to cooperate with human engineering principles. "About as well as can be expected when you're trying to retrofit 21st century defense systems onto a palace that was designed by people who thought structural integrity meant aesthetically pleasing crystal formations," Jake replied. "The energy shields are operational, but they're designed to stop conventional projectiles and basic energy weapons. If the Kethvar show up with anything more sophisticated than a stern lecture, we're going to be in trouble." Queen Zarathal herself had been surprisingly involved in the upgrade process, displaying a technical curiosity that Jake found both refreshing and slightly unnerving. Unlike most of the royalty he'd worked for during his career as a military contractor, she actually understood the systems he was installing and asked intelligent questions about their capabilities and limitations. She was a striking figure, even by the standards of a species known for their ethereal beauty. Like all members of the ethereal royal bloodline, her skin possessed a subtle luminescence that seemed to emanate from within, and her ears swept back in elegant points that somehow managed to look both delicate and regal. What set her apart was the intelligence in her crystalline blue eyes and the genuine warmth she showed toward everyone in the palace, from the highest-ranking officials to the maintenance staff who cleaned the crystal formations. "She's not what you'd expect from absolute monarchy," Jake had told Lieutenant Kim during one of their progress briefings. "Most royals I've worked for treat engineers like particularly useful furniture. She actually remembers people's names and asks about their families. That's either very enlightened or very manipulative," Kim had observed. "With her, I think it's genuine, which makes this whole situation more depressing, honestly. She deserves better than what's probably coming." What was probably coming was a Kethvar decapitation strike designed to eliminate the Dominion's leadership and leave the population demoralized and leaderless. Intelligence reports suggested the coalition had been studying the palace's defenses for months, possibly with inside information about the upgrade schedule and defensive capabilities. The Crimson Sentinels, Queen Zarathal's elite guard, were legendary warriors whose ancestors had protected the royal bloodline for over 1,000 years. They moved through the palace corridors with the fluid grace characteristic of their species, their ceremonial armor gleaming with embedded crystals that served both decorative and defensive purposes. Jake had grown increasingly troubled by what he observed during their training exercises and security patrols. The Sentinels were undoubtedly skilled fighters, but their skills had been honed against opponents who followed the same cultural rules of engagement that governed ethereal society. They fought with precision, honor, and restraint, qualities that would be admirable in a sporting competition and potentially fatal against enemies who considered such conventions to be tactical weaknesses to be exploited. Have you ever seen them fight against opponents who don't play by ethereal rules? Jake had asked Captain Velkin, the Sentinel's commanding officer, during a security briefing. The Crimson Sentinels have defended the royal house for a millennium, Velkin had replied, his tone suggesting that the question itself was borderline insulting. Our courage and skill are beyond question. I'm not questioning your courage or skill, Jake had said carefully. I'm asking about your experience with enemies who don't share your concepts of honorable combat. The Kethvar don't issue formal challenges or fight fair. They use overwhelming force, terrorist tactics, and psychological warfare designed to break enemy morale before the real fighting begins. Velkin's elegant features had shifted into what Jake recognized as the ethereal expression of polite dismissal. We have prepared for all contingencies, Engineer Harrison. The palace defenses are more than adequate. That conversation had taken place 3 weeks ago, and every intelligence update since then had made Jake more certain that adequate was not going to be sufficient when the coalition finally made their move. The Kethvar had systematically eliminated every other major power in this sector, and their success rate suggested they were very good at identifying and exploiting the psychological weaknesses of their enemies. As Jake made his final checks on the defensive grid, he found himself hoping that his pessimistic assessment was wrong. Maybe the Sentinel's legendary courage would prove stronger than his engineering calculations suggested. Maybe the upgraded shields would hold longer than his worst-case scenarios predicted. Maybe the coalition would find a more attractive target and leave the Dominion alone. The explosions that shattered the crystal walls at dawn the next morning proved that maybe wasn't going to be enough. The first explosion came at 5:47 local time, shattering Jake's sleep and the illusion that the palace's defensive systems would provide adequate warning of incoming threats. The crystalline walls of his quarters rang like enormous bells as shock waves cascaded through the structure, and his emergency communicator immediately began screaming alerts in both standard and the melodic tones of ethereal common. "Well," Jake said to nobody in particular as he rolled out of bed and grabbed his emergency kit. So much for maybe. The engineering control center had become a chaos of flashing displays and urgent alarms, each screen showing a different aspect of a coordinated assault that was proceeding with terrifying precision. The Kethvar forces had bypassed the outer orbital defenses through a combination of stealth technology and what appeared to be detailed intelligence about patrol schedules and sensor blind spots. "They know exactly where to hit us," Lieutenant Kim reported, her fingers flying across the tactical displays as she tried to coordinate defensive responses that were already failing. "They're targeting the power grid nodes you identified as critical vulnerabilities, the communication relays, and the structural support points for the defensive shield generators." "Inside information," Jake said grimly, watching explosions cascade through the crystal spires with surgical precision. "Someone's been feeding them our upgrade specifications and defensive protocols." The Kethvar assault was unlike anything in the recorded military history of the ethereal dominion. Instead of the formal challenges and honorable single combat that characterized warfare between civilized species, The coalition forces moved with the ruthless efficiency of exterminators clearing out vermin. They used overwhelming firepower, coordinated strikes, and psychological warfare designed to break enemy morale before conventional resistance could organize. Jake's communication systems began receiving reports from throughout the palace, and what he heard filled him with growing horror. The Crimson Sentinels, those legendary guardians whose courage was supposed to be absolute, were abandoning their posts as the reality of actual combat shattered their ceremonial confidence. Sentinel Unit 7 has retreated from the eastern approach, came one report. Sentinel Unit 3 requests permission to fall back to secondary positions, came another. Secondary positions that sounded increasingly like escape routes, Jake realized with sick certainty. Through the security feeds, he watched elite warriors who had strutted through the palace halls with arrogant pride flee in panic when faced with enemies who shot to kill rather than engage in formal dueling protocols. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. If the legendary Sentinels couldn't stand against the coalition, what hope did anyone else have? "Chief, we need to evacuate the engineering levels," Kim said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The main assault force is working through the mid-levels, and our defensive perimeters are collapsing faster than the automated systems can adapt." Jake studied the tactical displays, tracking the Kethvar advance through maintenance tunnels and service corridors that he knew better than anyone else in the palace. His 8 months of upgrade work had required detailed knowledge of every structural system, every hidden passage, and every emergency protocol that might keep critical personnel alive during exactly this kind of crisis. "You evacuate," he told Kim, pulling up schematics that showed possible routes to the throne room. "I need to make sure the Queen's personal defense systems are still operational." "That's not your job, Chief. You're a civilian contractor, not a bodyguard." "It's not about job descriptions," Jake replied, checking his emergency kit for tools that might be useful in a combat situation, though his sonic wrench and diagnostic scanners weren't exactly military-grade weapons. "Someone needs to ensure the defensive systems I installed are actually protecting what they're supposed to protect." The irony wasn't lost on him as he began moving through maintenance tunnels toward the palace's upper levels. He was a civilian whose greatest weapon was an engineering toolkit, heading toward a battle zone that trained warriors were fleeing. But 8 months of working alongside Queen Zarathal had shown him something the Crimson Sentinels had apparently forgotten: leadership that was based on genuine care for others rather than ceremonial authority deserved protection that came from choice rather than obligation. The tactical displays showed the Kethvar forces systematically eliminating resistance as they advanced through the palace corridors. Their movements suggested this wasn't a raid for resources or territorial conquest. This was a decapitation strike aimed specifically at eliminating the Dominion's leadership and breaking the population's will to resist. "Engineering command to all personnel," Jake broadcast through the emergency channels as explosions continued to shake the crystal structure around him. "Defensive systems are holding in sectors 7 through 12, but power grid damage is causing cascade failures. Recommend immediate evacuation of non-essential personnel to designated safe zones." The responses he received painted a picture of systematic abandonment. The few guards who hadn't fled outright were falling back to defensive positions that looked increasingly like organized retreat routes. The palace staff had largely scattered, and even the senior officials were evacuating to secure locations that would keep them alive but wouldn't help defend their queen. Through his engineering displays, Jake could track the approaching Kethvar forces as they bypassed his carefully designed security systems with expertise that confirmed his suspicions about inside intelligence. Someone with access to his upgrade specifications had provided detailed information about defensive capabilities, structural vulnerabilities, and emergency protocols. As he reached the outer chambers of the throne room, Jake's communication systems began receiving the final reports that confirmed his worst fears. The Crimson Sentinels, the last line of defense between Queen Zarathol and her enemies, were requesting permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. In other words, they were asking permission to abandon their sworn duty and leave their queen to face the enemy alone. Jake arrived just in time to see the last of the legendary Guardians disappear down an evacuation corridor, with barely concealed relief at having survived long enough to run. Through the transparent crystal walls, he could see Queen Zarathol standing alone in the throne room, her ceremonial robes gleaming with embedded crystals that caught the emergency lighting like trapped stars. She stood with quiet dignity, alone and abandoned, as the sound of approaching enemy forces echoed through the palace corridors. And Jake realized that whatever happened next, at least one person in this palace was going to remember what loyalty actually meant. The throne room had been transformed from a place of regal beauty into something that resembled a crystal cathedral, awaiting its final service. Emergency lighting cast long shadows through the shattered barriers, and the sound of approaching Kethvar forces echoed through corridors that no longer held any defenders except for Jake's own stubborn presence in the maintenance systems. Queen Zarathol stood in the center of the vast chamber, her luminous skin pale, with the realization that centuries of loyalty and tradition had evaporated in the face of real danger. She wasn't cowering or pleading. Her posture remained erect, dignified, prepared to meet whatever came with the same grace she had shown during 8 months of Jake's professional observations. Through his engineering displays, Jake could track the final Kethvar strike team as they methodically worked through the palace's last defensive layers. Their movements were visible as heat signatures and energy readings, professional soldiers executing a plan that had been rehearsed to eliminate every possible variable except the ones they couldn't predict. Jake's rational mind provided a steady stream of excellent reasons why he should follow the Sentinel's example and evacuate to a safe distance. He was a civilian contractor whose job description included defensive system installation, but definitely not heroic last stands against superior military forces. His death wouldn't change the outcome of an invasion that had been planned with military precision and executed with brutal efficiency. His engineering toolkit contained nothing that could remotely be considered a weapon. A sonic wrench, diagnostic scanners, emergency repair supplies, and a portable power cell that might be useful for something other than its intended purpose if he got creative enough. His combat training consisted entirely of basic safety protocols from his military contractor certification, which focused more on avoiding dangerous situations than engaging in them. But watching Queen Zarathol stand alone in the throne room, abandoned by the warriors who had sworn to protect her with their lives, Jake found himself remembering why he had grown to respect her during their months of professional interaction. She had never treated him like useful furniture or a necessary inconvenience. She had learned the names of maintenance workers, asked intelligent questions about the systems he was installing, and shown genuine concern for the well-being of everyone in the palace, regardless of their rank or station. The approaching enemy forces were visible now through the crystal barriers, their armor gleaming with weapons designed for maximum intimidation as well as lethality. The Kethvar were known for their psychological warfare tactics. They wanted their enemies to feel fear and despair before the actual killing began, breaking resistance through terror as much as superior firepower. "This is monumentally stupid," Jake said quietly to himself, as he moved through the final maintenance passage that would bring him to the throne room's outer chambers. This is the kind of stupidity that gets studied in military academies, as an example of what happens when civilians think they understand combat tactics. But he kept moving anyway, because sometimes stupidity and courage were separated by nothing more than perspective and timing. The Kethvar strike team had reached the throne room's entrance, their weapons trained on Queen Zarathol with the cold efficiency of soldiers executing a predetermined execution. Through the transparent walls, Jake could see their leader, a figure in advanced battle armor whose movements suggested complete confidence in the mission's outcome. Queen Zarathul hadn't noticed Jake's presence yet. Her attention was focused on the approaching enemies, her crystalline blue eyes reflecting the harsh light of their energy weapons. She stood motionless, dignified, prepared to face death with the same grace she had shown in life. Jake realized he had perhaps 10 seconds to make a decision that would define not just the next few minutes, but everything he believed about courage, loyalty, and the difference between duty that was imposed and protection that was chosen. The rational choice was obvious. Step back into the maintenance passage, seal the access hatch, and survive long enough to report what had happened to whoever eventually investigated the fall of the ethereal dominion. He was one person with no weapons, no combat training, and no realistic hope of changing the outcome of a military operation that had been planned by professionals. The human choice was equally obvious, if considerably more dangerous. Through his portable display, Jake watched the strike team leader raise his energy blade, its harsh light reflecting off the scattered crystal fragments that had once been beautiful palace walls. The weapon was designed for ceremonial execution as much as efficient killing. The Kethvar wanted Queen Zarathul's death to be witnessed, recorded, and broadcast as a demonstration of what happened to leaders who resisted coalition expansion. Jake stepped out of the shadows. "Hey," he said conversationally, his voice carrying clearly through the throne room's acoustic properties. "I think you might be in the wrong place. The gift shop is 2 levels down and about half a kilometer that way." The strike team leader's weapon froze in position as every member of the assault force turned toward the unexpected voice. Their armor's sensor arrays focused on Jake's position, trying to classify a threat that didn't match any of the tactical profiles they had prepared for. "You are not on the target list," the leader said, his voice rendered mechanical by the armor's communication systems. "Withdraw immediately, or be eliminated as collateral damage." Queen Zarathul's luminous eyes widened as she realized what was happening. For the first time since he had known her, Jake saw something in her expression that might have been hope mixed with horror at the implications of his presence. "You cannot stop us," the strike team leader stated with the flat certainty of someone whose plans had accounted for every possible variable except the one standing in front of him. "Probably not," Jake agreed cheerfully, his engineering toolkit still slung over his shoulder like he was heading to fix a broken power coupling rather than face down a squad of professional killers. "But I can definitely make this more complicated than you planned for. And humans, we're really good at making things complicated." The moment before everything changed, Jake caught Queen Zarathul's gaze and saw understanding pass between them. She knew, as he did, that his intervention was symbolic rather than tactical, one person choosing to stand when everyone else had chosen to run. But sometimes symbols were more dangerous than weapons, and sometimes choosing to stand was more important than the odds of survival. The energy blade that was meant for Queen Zarathul's heart found Jake's shoulder instead. The pain immediate and shocking as the weapon's edge bit through his contractor coveralls and into flesh that had never been designed to stop military-grade cutting tools. But his position between the assassins and their target had accomplished exactly what he had hoped for. It disrupted their formation, created chaos in their precisely orchestrated execution, and transformed a calculated murder into something messier and more personal. "That really stings," Jake said through gritted teeth, his left arm hanging useless but his right hand still functional enough to activate the emergency protocols he had installed throughout the throne room. "I don't suppose you'd consider this a learning experience and call it even." The strike team leader's response was to raise his weapon for a killing blow that would eliminate the unexpected variable that had disrupted their mission parameters. But Jake's 8 months of defensive upgrades hadn't been limited to energy shields and structural reinforcements. He had installed systems that Queen Zarathal had insisted on understanding personally, even when her advisors had considered such technical knowledge beneath royal attention. "Emergency Protocol 7, the Queen said clearly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never forgotten that leadership meant taking action when others hesitated. The throne room transformed around them as blast shields deployed from hidden recesses in the crystal walls. Emergency barriers rose from the floor to create defensive cover, and automated systems that Jake had programmed for exactly this scenario began creating a tactical environment that favored defenders who knew the terrain over attackers who had planned for a simple execution. "Clever," the strike team leader admitted, his mechanical voice carrying grudging respect as his squad adapted their positions to account for defensive measures that hadn't appeared in their intelligence briefings. "But temporary. These barriers will not hold indefinitely." "They don't have to hold indefinitely," Jake replied, pressing his back against an emergency bulkhead as energy blasts scorched the crystal walls around them. "They just have to hold long enough." Queen Zarathal moved with fluid grace to Jake's position, her ceremonial robes now stained with his blood, as she applied emergency medical supplies from the defensive stations he had positioned throughout the chamber. Her touch was gentle but efficient. Field medicine techniques that suggested royal education had included more practical skills than most people realized. "This was not your fight," she said softly, her luminous eyes reflecting pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. "Actually, it was," Jake replied, wincing as she sealed the energy weapon's cauterized wound with emergency medical gel. "8 months of working alongside you, watching you care about everyone in this palace from the highest officials to the cleaning staff, that made it my fight. That made you someone worth protecting." The firefight that erupted in the crystal corridors beyond the throne room announced the arrival of palace security forces, who had finally rallied after the initial shock of the invasion. The Kethvar strike team found themselves caught between Jake's defensive installations and reinforcements who were no longer fleeing in panic, but fighting with the desperate courage of people defending something they valued. Through his portable display, Jake could monitor the broader battle as coalition forces clashed with ethereal defenders throughout the palace complex. The outcome remained uncertain, but the psychological impact of the failed execution had already begun reverberating through both armies. The Kethvar's aura of invincibility had been damaged by their inability to complete a simple assassination, while the ethereal forces had found their courage returning as word spread that their queen still lived. "Your Crimson Sentinels abandoned their posts," Jake said during a brief lull in the energy weapon exchanges, his voice carrying no judgment but simple observation. "They were raised to believe that courage was their birthright rather than their choice," Queen Zarathal replied, her tone reflecting understanding rather than anger. When faced with enemies who did not respect their legendary reputation, they discovered that inherited valor is no substitute for personal conviction. The strike team leader's voice carried through the chamber's communication systems, mechanical precision giving way to something that might have been frustration. "You cannot change the outcome. The coalition will take this system whether you die today or tomorrow. Your resistance serves no purpose." "See, that's where you're wrong," Jake called back, checking the charge levels on his emergency power cells and discovering that desperate circumstances really did make people creative with their available resources. "Our resistance serves a very important purpose. It proves that some things are worth defending, even against impossible odds. And it proves that loyalty cannot be commanded or inherited," Queen Zarathal added, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was rewriting the fundamental principles of royal governance through direct experience. "True loyalty is demonstrated through choice, especially when that choice involves sacrifice." The battle's climax came not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the simple arithmetic of determination. The Kethvar strike team had been equipped and trained for a quick execution followed by extraction, not for sustained combat against defenders who refused to yield and reinforcements who had found their courage in the example of an engineer who chose to stand when warriors chose to flee. As the last of the coalition forces were either captured or eliminated, Jake found his consciousness wavering from blood loss and shock. The emergency medical gel had stopped the bleeding, but energy weapon wounds required treatment beyond field medicine, and the adrenaline that had sustained him through the crisis was giving way to the body's natural response to trauma. Queen Zarathul supported his weight as palace medics arrived with proper equipment and pharmaceutical interventions, her luminous skin reflecting the emergency lighting like captured starlight. But her eyes held a determination that had been transformed by the events of the past hour, royal authority tempered by the recognition that true strength came from those who chose to serve rather than those who demanded service. "Let it be known throughout the realm," she said, her words carrying through the throne room's communication systems to be recorded for posterity, "that true loyalty cannot be commanded, only earned. That courage belongs not to those who claim it by birthright, but to those who demonstrate it through choice. And that the greatest honor of my reign will be that when all others fled, one person chose to stand, not because of oath or obligation, but because he believed some things are worth protecting." The last thing Jake saw before the medical sedatives claimed his consciousness was Queen Zarathul's face, her expression no longer the distant gaze of royalty, but the fierce gratitude of someone who had learned the difference between subjects who serve from duty and allies who stand from conviction. When he woke 3 days later in the Palace Medical Center, Jake discovered that the failed assassination had triggered a complete restructuring of the ethereal Dominion's government, military, and social hierarchy. The Crimson Sentinels had been disbanded, their positions offered to those who had demonstrated actual courage rather than inherited privilege. The defensive systems he had installed were being expanded throughout the Dominion, but more importantly, the concept of earned loyalty versus inherited obligation had become the foundation of a new governmental philosophy. "How do you feel about being accidentally responsible for a political revolution?" Queen Zarathul asked, settling into the chair beside his medical bed with the easy grace of someone who had spent the past 3 days rewriting the fundamental principles of interstellar governance. "Honestly, I was just trying not to watch a friend get murdered," Jake replied, testing his shoulders' range of motion and discovering that ethereal medical technology was impressively thorough. The political revolution was entirely unintentional. "The best revolutions usually are," she said, and her smile held depths that seemed to contain entire galaxies of possibility. "They emerge from simple choices made by people who refuse to accept that terrible things are inevitable." The bond forged between engineer and queen in those desperate moments had become something that transcended traditional categories of loyalty, service, or political alliance. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, demonstrated courage, and the simple recognition that some principles were worth defending regardless of the personal cost. And as Jake looked into Queen Zarathul's luminous eyes, no longer the distant gaze of inherited royalty, but the fierce determination of leadership earned through crisis, he realized that sometimes the most important engineering